Hello and welcome here from University of Cambridge, UK, from the Finance, Risk and Accounting Perspectives Conference, and in combination with the Social and Sustainable Finance and Impact Investing Conference. Today I will be speaking about mapping climate justice, and it's part of a larger project on intergenerational equity, the fairness to provide an at least as favorable standard of living as we are experiencing today to future generations. And I define intergenerational equity as a natural behavioral law, something that has been practiced ever since. Mankind would not exist if there is no transfer between the elder and the younger. You see this in all major codifications, you see it in religious foundations, that intergenerational equity has impact on mankind, and man would not exist if there's not a care for the young. On the other hand, I make the argument that globalization puts pressure onto future generations in terms of emergent risks. But how do you measure the impact of globalization onto society? One of the theories that's out there is the theory of social representations, in which you would see the impact of external influences, external shocks coming down on society, how society copes with it and negotiates around these shocks that come externally. And what I did is I went, in order to collect data, to a future conference on justice responsibility for the future. I had the data from 110 experts from all over the world, world leaders, and about 48,500 words. And what I then did is I categorized it here, just to give an example, how I categorized different notions on intergenerational equity. And what I found in 2011 by the data of 110 experts is that intergenerational equity considerations are comprised of pension reform needs in the wake of a Western world population that is aging, over-indebtedness. If a US child is born these days, it gets a $60,000 US heavy debt rucksack that ends up to be $160,000 US dollars per taxpayer. And environmental ethicality, ecologic sustainability, and climate change arising on the horizon. That led to the inception of the Mapping Climate Justice project, in which I look into three different dimensions of climate justice. One is a fairness argument within a country or within a society, and there I create, or I make the argument of creative taxation strategies. On the one hand, a progressive taxation should ensure that not lower income households carry a higher proportional burden of the climate change stabilization strategy. So if a lower income household faces a progressive or is part of a progressive taxation system, the burden should not be weighing higher in their pockets. Then the other argument is, of course, a consumption tax to curb harmful pollution, to curb harmful activities that lead to a warming of the globe. And an interesting taxation strategy is how do you tax past world inhabitants, or tax past pollution, or tax past economic activities that led to a warming of the earth. Inheritance tax can be an interesting strategy to reap the wealth built on past pollution. If the tax year is over, usually it becomes unconstitutional that there is a retroactive taxation. But with inheritance tax, so for instance, if a CEO transfers a corporation to another CEO, if you would create an inheritance tax there, you could tax or reap the benefits of past economic activities that potentially led to past pollution or past global warming offsetting activities. Fairness between countries speaks about the fairness, the climate justice argument in between world countries. And here it becomes interesting what climate justice means, what legal code we should apply. It touches on a variety of different legal arguments. And for instance, private property gets destroyed directly by climate instabilities. There are already projections that Manhattan will be halfly underwater in 200 years, so the private property holders there might be, or if you have real estate in Manhattan, you might have problems with your private property then. But on the other hand, we already see it in hurricanes. The destruction of private property is vital. On the other hand, climate is traditionally a common good. Breathing air is a natural resource, a common good. And with climate change migration or climate change induced migration streams, we do see the argument of climate justice becoming a human right if you have the destruction of small nation island states and people losing their land. So a lot of different legal codes would apply to climate justice. One of the interesting cases how you have a connection between private property and common good when you could disown private or neglect private property claims for the sake of a common good comes actually from international law, where you have in restitution cases you find if there was a private property and the private property holder is not alive anymore, and the good now could create more of a common goods value. A country in international law can disown another country. You find that, for instance, with the stone of Rosetta, which is a historic stone that was found in the desert in Egypt, in Alexandria, by Napoleon. It helped decipher the ancient Egypt language, hieroglyphs. And the stone then got transferred not from Napoleon, and through wars it ended up being exhibited in London in a national gallery or in a national museum here. And Egypt has tried to restitute this stone, but by the argumentation that the private property holder is not alive, we do not know who was the initial possessor, creator of this stone, but also by the argument that in London you do have a very stable city, you do have protection and conservation of that stone better than in a desert near Cairo. And by the argument that it gives it gestalt, a museum, because it is exhibited with a lot of other exponents that are there on display. You do have the, or UK in international law has the upper hand and has not restituted this stone. This is just an example, but you could use this argumentation and flip it somehow a bit around, and with a legal subsumption you could make the argument that those countries that have better means of protection and conservation and who reap a higher benefit from the warming of a common earth would also have a higher responsibility now in our case to protect the stable climate. And then the third argument that I make, the third dimension, looks into climate justice, fairness over time. And over time here the argumentation is to use an interesting climate change stabilization financing strategy through bonds. Bonds have been in history used throughout history to raise funds for ideologies. World War I and II on the American but also on the European side have been funded by bonds. And here you could make the interesting argument that you could use these bonds for climate change stabilization, and the funds that are raised by bonds you would use in order to create positive market incentives. So this current race to the bottom, the country the company that can produce cheaper, which is usually done by by using polluting energy sources. The country that can produce cheaper can offer a better price that reaps a higher benefit on the market. You could turn this race to the bottom into a race to the top by offering incentives, subsidies tax breaks for using clean energy. And once you do this, you create a race to the top by companies actually competing over using cleaner energy. And so you would create a race to the top in that sense. And over time, you could make the Gestalt argument that I brought in the last dimension. You could use the Gestalt argument and say, this is not only a Pareto optimal, economically Pareto optimal or a Pareto improving situation between generations. The current generation, through bonds, would not curb economic activities. By being subsidized for using clean energy, they could still produce. And the next generation would need to repay the bonds. They would be beneficiaries of a stable climate, but would offset the costs for the bonds by past or by future payments of past bonds initiation. And here you could make the gestalt of different generations having a Pareto optimal solution and having over time a better economic output, avoiding tipping points and irreversible lock-ins. Now back to the second dimension, climate justice in between countries. What I did is I calculated out of a data set of 88 countries around the world. You do have the medium temperature, so how hot it is throughout the year in 188 countries, which is of course, which varies broadly throughout the world. You do have 4.25 degrees Celsius estimated climate or global warming until 2100. And you do have GDP-wise, so gross domestic product, the productivity measure, economic output measure around the world. You do have the information of a cardinal temperature, which is the best temperature for the three pillars of GDP, agriculture, service, and industry. You do have the highest, the optimal temperature for these three pillars of GDP, being the most productive. And with this information, with the information of how hot it is going to be around the globe in 2100 estimated, and the cardinal temperature for GDP, you can estimate who are the winners and who are the losers of a warming Earth. And shockingly, I find if you collapse over different countries, but also by integrating different models. So I calculate from a reference point, which is the cardinal temperature. I calculate three different models. One that would be a linear, would assume a linear rise and fall of 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius off the climate point, the optimal cardinal temperature point. But also I assume a prospect model and a hyperbolic discount counting model, in which you would say the gains and losses are hyperbolically centered around the optimum temperature. Prospect would be concave gains and convex losses. And over these three economic models, I collapsed them. I collapsed the 188 countries, and I find that the Earth until 2100 will be, by GDP means, gaining more from warming than losing. In terms of countries, that is here you see 1/3 countries of the data set of 188 countries, 1/3 and 1/3. Green are the winners. Yellow is the ones around the reference point, which we have in the middle. And red, we have the countries that have run out of time. How does this look around the globe? Here you see the equator belt is pretty much the worst off, and on the poles you do have a warming Earth. You have the highest or the longest time ahead with a favorable climate for GDP growth. Here comes the injustice argument. If you divide it by the countries by 1/3 of gains, you see gains are highly, it's just a few countries that will gain a lot. And here you see the shifting up here, the middle and the losers pretty much stay the same. But here you see that only a few countries will win a lot from global warming. Who are the winners in terms of countries? Canada, Russia, Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Iceland, Finland, Norway, Sweden, just to name the first few ones. Per capita, so per inhabitant of countries, the most, the countries that, or the inhabitants that win the most are the inhabitants of Liechtenstein, San Marino, Monaco, Iceland, Luxembourg, Bhutan, Montenegro, Estonia, and Mongolia. Climate change losers, we do have Qatar, Bahrain, Brunei, UAE, Kiribati, Mauritius, Tuvalu, Djibouti. And per capita, you already see the injustice, over injustice. Tuvalu, Palau, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Seychelles, Antigua, St. Kitts will be losing the most per capita. And those are already also the countries that will be swallowed by rising sea level the first. And interestingly, I find in the Paris Agreement and in the preceding agreement, or in the preceding annual conferences on climate, you saw that there was a start of reporting of greenhouse gas emissions per country, and I see a highly significant correlation between who's a loser, who's a winner, and who reports higher or lower greenhouse gas emissions. So the more a country emits, the more time ahead the country has overall. And I only do this research in order to show there is injustice in terms of where the climate gains will be centered around the globe. I only do this. I only make this argument in order to show that there should be transfers. So I started calculating in a model climate change benefit transfers, and I want to make the argument that the benefits transfers should be used to offset the costs of a warming Earth, to offset climate change mitigation and adaptation around the globe. And in order to make this argument that the benefit transfers should directly go into the losing parts of the world, I do want to factor in GDP per inhabitant. There are some countries in the world that report hardly any GDP, and I do think that it makes sense to factor in GDP because the model is based on GDP growth. And the idea here is that those countries whose GDP, or those countries with a rising GDP prospect, should tax, especially here, I have it in the data, the industries that will win the most. And this tax should be directly funding the countries and the industries that will be losing or are already losing from a warming Earth. Let aside the countries who have less of a GDP problem. Transfers, this is the distribution overall. Who are the major grantors in this model? That would be then Liechtenstein. Here you see that the GDP plays a role. Liechtenstein, Canada, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Finland, Monaco, Denmark, Austria, and the United States. And tax transfer beneficiaries weighted by GDP per inhabitant. That's pretty much Qatar, UAE, Singapore, Brunei, Bahrain, Kuwait, Trinidad, Tobago should be the major recipients. Here you see it on the map. The grantors are green, the red ones are the beneficiaries. And the last data piece that I will present right now is I want to make the argument injustice, how the gains of climate change are distributed around the globe, but there's already a trend of these winning countries taking the lead in terms of GDP, and I show this by human capital and financial streams. So I calculated climate induced, or not, I calculated migration, but I say it might be climate induced. And I found a significant correlation between the climate change winners and human migration inflows. So we already see human migration streams into the winning countries. on a data set of 187 countries in the world. And I find financial inflows, foreign direct investments, which is usually a financial inflow from one country to another, given for an economic purpose. And I find that the climate change winning countries report, I see a financial foreign direct investment inflow into the climate change winners. As a cross-validation of this finding, I look into if I see migration streams, if I see financial inflows, do in these countries potentially remittances go back to the loser countries? Imagine a father goes into another more productive country and sends back money as a gift, remittance or the gift back to family that potentially stayed in a warmer part of the earth. Do remittances potentially undermine my effect? And it is not the case. As a cross-validation, I find no significant remittances inflow into the losing countries. To make the argument even starker. With that, I leave it to the three-dimensional climate justice approach. And I make the argument that overall countries, these countries that are winning, that these sectors that are winning GDP-wise from a favorable position on the earth should be potentially taxed in order to raise funds. In the climate-losing countries, the countries that have potentially already run out of a favorable climate, in terms of GDP production, that those countries should be using the bonds strategy in order to create a more just allocation in between generations. And in these countries, there should be this offsetting or race to the top, that these transfers get funded or fund the financialization of climate stability, but also put positive market incentives out to use clean energy. That's the overall picture. Overall, I can say this project is the first theoretical introduction in that the warming of the earth might have very positive effects overall. And that hopefully should help macroeconomic nudging, but also should hopefully embrace more stakeholders, those who are shied away or are seeing climate change as a very negative thing, that they come back to the negotiation table and have an interest in slicing the cake of wins of a warming earth. Empirically, it's the first introduction of climate change winners and losers based on GDP. I am not making a very earth science argument. I'm sure there are better ways to measure how the warming earth can be productive. This is just meant as a first step to open a gate to set the stage for better researchers to come, more refined to calculate more refined gains and losses of a warming earth. Definitely there should be a more focus on where are people really living. Taking a medium temperature is critical. Also calculating extreme risks into the factor would be important, seeing if people are living in haven areas that might be flooded, that might create higher risks. Those would be sophistications of the model that I hope other people will do in the future. This was just as a first preliminary introduction of the idea. Let's also focus on the winds, and there the financialization of the Paris Agreement becomes very easy if you see that the Earth is actually winning more than losing until 2100. Practical, yes, the financialization of the Paris Agreement is possible, seems to be possible with these results. And I do hope that this research inspires cadre of future climate researchers to also look into the gains of a warming Earth, a common warming Earth that can be reaped for the benefits of the greater good, but also for the benefits over time for future generations. And with that, I end it, thankfully for your patience, and open it up to you for questions.